I'm Caroline Hardaker, the author of Composite Creatures, which came out with Angry Robot Books just very recently.
And I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm the author of The Second Bell, Slavic folklore-inspired fantasy, also from Angry Robot Books, and just came out last March. And we are Bookish Take.
And this time we're going to do something slightly different. So in the last episode, Gabriela hosted a discussion between me and Chris Pantier about dystopias. And this time we're lucky to be joined by the author of The Witch's Heart, Genevieve Gornichec, to talk about fantasy with Gabriela, who also wrote a fantasy book recently. So thank you for coming, Genevieve. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's awesome to be here.
Yay! So I guess just to start, a very general question. I wanted to ask you both, with you both writing sort of historical fantasy specifically, what drew you to that genre? Do you have other interests in this stuff, or what is it about that genre that made you want to write it?
Escapism.
That's it, really. That's a good enough answer.
I mean,
that's a really common answer.
Genevieve does some really interesting, like, because you're quite steeped in sort of historical reenactments, aren't you?
Ooh.
What am I looking at?
Got all my historical reenactment stuff over here.
Oh wow.
that was not product placement. That was me just storing things there, and they happened to be in the frame.
Coincidence.
Right.
I must say, I think I've seen stuff like that you've done on Twitter, because I'm really into crafting and stuff anyway. And you do a lot of like weaving and stuff as well, like Norse kind of. That's brilliant. And so is this something you've always been interested in for a long time, or?
Yeah, it's so I got into Vikings about 10 years ago. I say Vikings, it's Norse mythology, the Icelandic sagas, all of that. And then I got into reenactment about 7 years ago. Living history 7 years ago. So it was kind of like the next extension of that particular obsession of mine.
That makes sense. So now you're living it in your head as well, through the pen.
Yeah.
Like what about you, Gabriela?
Well, I think, fantasy as a genre is like gives us such a wonderful opportunity to kind of explore the worlds of our imagination and to sort of flesh them out and give them life. And when it comes to kind of historical context, I think it's just really interesting to look back on history and kind of reimagine the points of it that might have been slightly different, the points where like humanity is sort of on the cusp of something, and you can, especially like in pre-industrial times, where you feel like there's a change that could happen, and what if the world was a little bit different and we could see all those other points of view. But that's really interesting for me. And clearly
I can understand that.
With
like a world of possibilities, really. Well, Genevieve, you already kind of touched on the fact that you've already had this interest in this specific mythology, kind of Norse mythology. But I wanted to ask you, like, what was it about this specific story and these specific characters that drew you to write about them? So why was it Angrboda? Why was it and Loki? Why did you choose those specific rather than focusing on, say, Odin or someone else?
I started really focusing in on them when I was taking a Norse mythology course as an undergraduate, and I wrote my term paper on Angrboda, actually, and her associations with different, the associations that she shared with different mysterious female figures in the mythology. And the book and the paper kind of got written at the same time. So that's why I chose to write about that, because Angrboda to me like is a character where we get a lot of like name dropping of women in Norse mythology, and then we never learn anything about them. Like we're given whole like lists and lists of giantesses and goddesses, and they don't have like a story or a voice. We're just like told, oh, and here were the goddesses. And so I just kind of wanted to expand at least one of the stories about one of these women.
I wanted to ask
you, other women.
Actually, since you did study it, do you think, like, after all this studying you did on the subject, do you reckon that those the reason that we don't learn much about those, you know, female like giantesses and the like goddesses and all that is because of who wrote it down. Do you think it's that it was just edited out, or maybe it wasn't there? Like, was it just like this very masculine?
Yeah, I highly suspect that those stories just didn't make it down to us because the authors who wrote them down just didn't care. I really believe that they existed, but they just didn't make it to us just due to the nature of what gets written into history and what doesn't. So I really do think because there's no reason that all of these goddesses and giantesses like would have existed with no other context anywhere. So
this is true, because there's so many mythologies where they filled in the gap where there would be a woman or a female, and they don't even name them in a lot of cases. So yeah, you would kind of presume that they do have their own story, but yeah, this is history, isn't it? It only gets saved by the people who, well, the few people that choose to, I guess. But what about you, Gabriela? Like, why did you choose the specific story that you did?
I mean, so, you know, I came to Slavic mythology sort of later in life. I kind of started, when I've started sort of being interested in mythologies, I read Norse mythologies, I read Greek and Roman and a bit of ancient Egyptian, but Slavic mythologies are actually because we're very fragmented, you get little hints of them, like stories, like bedtime stories, you know, like, or like little songs, or some small rituals, like, you know, for kind of just like a fun thing to do. But I think they're really kind of underrated, underrepresented, even within the sort of Slavic nations. People don't actually know very much about them. And I think because, you know, the way, obviously, with the advent of Christianity, a lot was erased. We didn't have the monks that would sort of go around and religiously write down, religiously monks, yeah. So that would sort of carefully write down all the stories to sort of preserve them for future generations. So that it was definitely more kind of, let's push all of it out. And if we can't completely erase it, let's neuter it and change it into something that is palatable for us. So, so with especially like, it's interesting what, you know, Genevieve was saying about like female side of things in the mythologies for Slavic stories. All the goddesses are either demons or saints. And the more powerful they are, the more curtailed their powers in the later stories. So, you know, we think about kind of goddesses of like Morana or Marzanna, who now academics think that she was a goddess of life and death, and almost like Kali-like figure, you know, like kind of this with those like links to kind of Mesopotamian myths and like and like Indian traditions. Like you have that link of this kind of very strong like bloody goddess, like with blood and death and rebirth, but all we have left of her is that every spring people, like as a fun thing to do, drown a dolly made of hay as the symbol of winter.
Right.
Like it's all that's left in the kind of general consciousness of her existence. So like I just think it's so interesting to try and delve into what's unsaid and try to kind of look beyond the stories as they are now and try to kind of recreate this atmosphere. You know, it's not like you're not going to get exactly right, and there's something freeing about it as well. But I think just to try and recreate the atmosphere and the relationship that people felt they had with this unseen world, that's something that's really interesting to me, those relationships with the creatures, with the gods.
Well, in terms of Well, in terms of the kind of technical writing of these things, I was thinking this is perhaps a little bit more for Genevieve, but with you, Gabriela, it is kind of relevant too. I was interested to know whether, because they are stories which have other interpretations at the moment, so in terms of the Norse stuff, the main thing that you'll think of is like Marvel or something, but they're stories, and it's a world that's been told a few times. Did you deliberately, were you affected by these, or did you deliberately try to stay away, or was it not a problem at all because you were delving into, I suppose because you were writing that paper at the same time, you were delving into different source material? Like, how did that affect your writing of it? And with you, Gabriela, it's kind of the same in terms of these small snippet kind of retellings that you pick up in little nursery rhymes and things. How did you both feel about that?
I'm pretty easily able to compartmentalize like the mythology versus Marvel. So that was never a problem for me. But when I was writing The Witch's Heart, I definitely only stuck to the Eddas, which are two main sources of Norse mythology that were written in Iceland in the 1300s. So hundreds of years after the Viking Age ended and hundreds of years after Iceland was Christianized. So these are the ancestors of the Vikings, the Christian ancestors of the Vikings, writing down their stories. So that's like an extra layer of bias to unpack when you're like considering these sources. And I really tried to stay away from like other Norse fiction while I was writing the book and while I was revising the book. And finally, when I turned it in, like the very final draft, because I first wrote it 10 years ago. But when I turned in the final draft to my publisher, like then I was like, okay, I'm gonna treat myself to a couple other Norse fiction books. Because it's amazing how easily you can like change your perception of like a character if you read another book about them written by somebody else and say, wait a second.
I can imagine that. I imagine they're completely, well, interpreted in completely different ways a lot of the time, according to who's written it, which is the nature of authors, I guess. Absolutely. Yeah. What about you, Gabriela?
I mean, you know, there's not as much when it comes to the sort of Slavic side of things in popular culture. I mean, more recently, obviously, there's The Witcher, but that's so different, and that's so kind of separate from what I'm doing, that it doesn't really enter into the into the consideration. There is a bit of a kind of revival of interest in Slavic and sort of, you know, pre-Christian Proto-Slavic mythologies in Poland at the moment. I don't know if that's true for other Slavic countries. So there's a little bit more being published in terms of kind of like popular science, like books on the sort of the beasts and creatures of Slavic legends and all that, and that's a really useful source for me. But I'm, you know, unlike Genevieve, like I'm not I don't have this very, like, I don't have a very academic approach to Slavic mythologies. It's so fragmented and it's so inconsistent. I feel like I have like this magpie approach. So I kind of pick and choose whatever appeals to me. And then I kind of, I try to preserve the feel of it, but as to the details and as to the kind of, you know, I don't know, the properties of a creature, I change that. And in the second bell, I mean, I completely changed the way I represented this strigas is so different to the way they appear in Slavic stories anyway. So in the Slavic stories, they're just straightforward monsters, and I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in how people react to the story and how people react to the threat or perceived threat, and, you know, especially if they don't know much about it, and how they can sort of build it up in their heads. So that's more of an interest for me.
Well, what about when it comes to the historical side of it all? Just thinking if anyone's watching who fancies giving historical fiction a go, how do you go about researching the detail for this sort of thing? Because I've often wondered this myself, because everything I've written has just been very firmly in the present day, unless it's been completely fantastical, and then I can just make up whatever I want. But I was thinking, how hard is it to get the detail in terms of, you know, things like what the houses would be like, clothing, food. Genevieve, I bet with you being a reenactor, you probably know a lot of this stuff and have picked it up. But have either of you got any kind of tips for people who would like to be a historical fiction writer?
Oh my gosh, I'm a bad person to ask
because it's a hard question.
Just because like when I did first write The Witch's Heart, 2011, it was 3 years before I started doing Viking Age living history, and I didn't know anything about their material culture. I just knew like the stories and had researched those. So like doing living history was what enabled me to like be able to pepper in like details about everyday life into the book.
The tablet weaving, I thought it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so that's how I did it, and I don't know how I would have done it otherwise, and that's why I'm a bad person to ask. I'm sorry.
Not at all. It's an honest answer. And doing a course or something, there's online courses for people, I guess, if there's a specific era that they're interested in. But what about you, Gabrielle? Did you have any?
I mean, I think that essentially people like Genevieve, like if you can meet them at like any events or something, that's just like wonderful like source of information. People who are, so interested in the period that they kind of want to share that knowledge. It's wonderful. I remember a lot of details from the Second Bell is actually some things I learned from when I visited a Cranach Centre in Aberfeldy in Scotland.
Right.
So basically, it's what Cranach Centre is a Cranach is essentially a house that's built on water. It's a big round house, and this kind of Iron Age, Stone Age, like Neolithic sort of societies kind of lived in houses like that. And I had the good luck to visit during one of their kind of reenactment days when they had people sort of just performing different everyday tasks, showing how to make dried cheese necklaces and how the kind of different foraging foods and all that, and some of those details did make it obviously into the book. And I thought it was just so wonderful because in the Second Bell, I wanted to take people from a society that is sort of on, if not industrial sort of era, then a kind of just pre-industrial, so sort of I was thinking kind of 17th century, maybe 18th century, distant place in the mountains, but it's reasonably sort of well developed. And then those people leave with nothing, and so it's almost like travel back in time, because they leave with nothing, and then they create a society in the mountains from everything around them. They have no forges, they have no metal work, they make do. And it's so I kind of held that in my mind. And also, when you're writing something that is inspired by a historical era rather than actual historical fiction, you get way more license. So, Google is your friend, and there's so many people out there with very specific knowledge. And I don't know, like, Jamie, like, what's the weirdest thing you researched for the book?
Oh man. I had to think a lot about, like, I guess, like, windows and doors and like house things, like, because Angrboda lives in a cave.
Yes.
Like, how would she like have a window, and like what would happen with the door?
Hinges that were still there.
Yeah. I actually originally she ponders those hinges for like 4 paragraphs, and then I ended up deleting them because I went down a rabbit hole of like Viking door hinges, which, like, I know about like chest hinges because like I know people who like forge them, but I didn't know like what if it would be the same kind of things like for doors. So just like little things like that where like they come up in the plot and you're like, wait, how would they do this? Like that and lighting too, because there's a lot of debate over, you know, how they would have, different longhouses, how they would have been lit on the inside. So
you see, this is why I'm not brave enough to have written any historical fiction yet. I'm just terrified of getting it wrong. Door hinges. Like, I went to a lecture once about, like, I think it was like medieval combs, and I was just like, it was like a 3-hour lecture. I was like, oh God, if there's this much about combs.
That is not surprising to me, at least in the Viking world. In the Viking age, combs are one of the most common grave finds. Like, they were obsessed with brushing their hair or something, combing their hair.
I think they were. There were so many different kinds of comb.
Right?
Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's the logical links that you make in terms of research, because you might not set out thinking that you're going to be researching types of spouts in teapot, but you know, if someone's coming to tea and you're like, oh wait, all the raw materials they have is like wood and I don't know and reeds, like how did they make it? So it's a, you know, that's the kind of, you know, when you have one problem and then that creates another problem and then you have to solve that and then you go in this line to try and research things, like, you know, and some of the things you're going to be researching are just so odd and like things you don't expect to have to research. Like, I find, Genevieve, like, do you find, like, I find YouTube really helpful for visual stuff, because obviously if someone describes something to me, it doesn't exactly give me the tools to then describe it itself. Like I had to watch, like, I watched quite a few cesarean section videos on YouTube, and I only have like, I didn't fully expect to find them there, to be honest, but you get it in all its gory detail, all of it, you know. And yeah, that was, I think, like for me the weirdest one to sort of have to go and research.
If anything's a demonstration, if you could find literally anything on the internet, maybe that is the truth. Well, changing tack slightly, I was going to mention that both of your stories have quite a bit in common. For one thing, they're both quite strongly themes of motherhood. Why did you both decide to write about that with the main focus in the case of your characters, Myriad and Angrboda?
For me, it kind of just came with the territory. Like, I didn't set out to write a story about motherhood. It just ended up that way just because, you know, the one thing that we do know about Angrboda from the sources, we only know that she's the mother of these 3 children, and that's it. We literally don't know anything else about her. So I took it from the angle of like, okay, like, she is a mother, that's really important to her to be a mother, and that's okay. That's okay. But what else? What else? Like, what else can we you know, find out about her? And so that was kind of the approach that I took. But then motherhood ended up being a central theme in the story in the end. Yeah,
that's great. What about you?
I actually did, like, pretty much set out to write about motherhood. I think, you know, like, I think, you know, mothers in general and motherhood are very much underrepresented in fantasy up until this now. And, you know, there's a lot of books coming out now which sort of more lean into the direction of exploring that side of human life. But I think when you had motherhood represented in sort of more classic fantasy fiction, it tended to be very much male focused somehow. And, you know, women, you know, who once they became mothers, their experience was seen through the eyes of men. And I wanted to show that, you know, it's like this whole huge part of human experience, and this huge part of women's experience in, you know, in a world that has been patriarchal for a vast majority of, you know, of recorded history. And I think it's very important to sort of explore it in relation to the sort of societies that those women live in, and because it does influence your relationship with your child, with your relationship with yourself and your expectations that you put on yourself. And, you know, I kind of wanted to show this, you know, that for the mother in my story, Myriad, there was this very clear expectation from the people she grew up around, that her duty towards her society was superseded her duty towards her child, and that she should abandon her child because it was rejected by her town. And so that kind of a choice, you know, whether or not to kind of go through with like leaving with your child in order to sort of protect your child, that's not as obvious as you know we would like to think. So that was, you know, kind of, you know, and how the other mothers in the story kind of viewed their role, and how they viewed their duty towards their child. That's something that's really interesting to me, and I kind of wanted to show it in a very woman-centric way.
Right. Well, both, in the cases of both Myriad and Angrboda, both stories start with those two women having a fresh start. So each woman definitely has a before and an after. Was that a deliberate choice to begin the story that way, or was that a deliberate choice? Like, I feel like there's something in that. I just was wondering if there was.
I like those parallels, actually, Genevieve.
Yeah.
So, like, I really love, like, I was reading your book because someone told me, I think my brother told me, like, he was, because he read my book and then he started reading your book on my recommendation and he read it faster than me. And he was like, did you like purposely like tell me to read it? Because it's like, it just seems to be so similar. And I thought, I thought it was very
cool when that happens.
Yeah, like that was me reading The Second Bell. I was like, oh, like I read that, oh, I didn't want it to end. I was like, oh, these vibes are so on point. Like, oh, I love this book so much. I love books where the mom doesn't die.
It's sadly rare.
I mean, you know, sometimes she has to die, and I'm not dissing over like fiction where there's a purpose to it all,
right.
But it is nice to have to be able to explore that aspect of life, you know, and not stripping the character of her personhood as well, isn't it?
Or using her only as the motivator for the main character's pain or character arc. That's on this.
So many times it's just the mother. She's just the mother. But yeah, definitely you both showed both characters as was a powerful person in with autonomy, which I personally very much enjoyed as well. I know it was great.
But to answer your question though, that seemed the place for me to start the book. That was like the first scene that I saw kind of in my head, is just Angrboda sitting by the riverbank, just right, what now? And then Loki comes up like, hey, you dropped this. So
it was quite haunting, I thought, at the beginning. I liked that. It felt, I don't know, it felt kind of, it felt spooky to me, and I like that. I like a spooky start.
Thanks so much.
Would either of you do sequels to your novels or explore the world of them any further?
The way The Witch's Heart ended, I don't see myself writing a sequel. Because I set out what I wanted to do, which is kind of tell the story of Norse mythology from beginning to end, the background.
What about hell, though?
I know, okay, everybody's saying that. So
I love her.
Me too. But I do want to revisit this world. I'm not done writing about the Norse gods. That is what I can tell you for sure. But in terms of like an actual sequel, I'm happy with where The Witch's Heart ended, and I don't think I would tell Hell's story in that way.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
What about you, Gabriela?
You know what? Like there is a character whose story I would like to retell, but like one of the side characters, and probably the least loved one of all the characters, but it's a question of kind of figuring out.
Which character is it? Am I allowed to ask?
Kalina. I like.
Oh, okay.
Everybody hates Kalina, and she is not a lovable character. but I kind of feel like there's just this is like this tragedy to kind of an outcast who becomes this fundamentalist essentially, and when their beliefs are so completely shattered, how do they find their way back to humanity? Like, and I'm just like, there's something like that would be quite interesting to explore there. Like, would they claw their way back to humanity? Would they find a purpose that would kind of change their direction, or would they just find another rabbit hole to fall down?
See, that would be a good emotional support project. You know, sometimes you just need those projects where you're like, this is probably never going to get published or see the light of day, but I need to get it out of my system, so I'm going to work on it. I have several of those.
Oh, well, you know, the last question I was going to ask was is like my favorite question, because it's like a really non-technical answer, but it's fun. So if it was ever filmed, your books, how do you see that? Do you see it as a film, a TV show? And who would you cast? Because I love visualizing these things, so I must know who you saw as those characters.
I want an animated Netflix special. That is literally my dream. But the problem with that is that it would just be Angrboda sitting in a cave for most of the story.
I don't know.
Well, so there's a couple other parts of Norse mythology that I would like to explore, different characters I'd like to explore. So like my dream is to be able to weave all of those together with Angrboda's story and have that be like an anime. Because I love animation. Like, I would much rather watch an animated movie than a live action personally.
Okay.
Plus, with animation, you wouldn't have to pay to CGI the kids.
True. That is true.
You would just have to pay to CGI the whole thing.
Oh yeah, of course.
Right, exactly.
I sort of didn't think of that.
But maybe if you wrote more, it could be like, you know, like Shadow and Bone, where they clearly don't trust Netflix to tell the entire story, like of all the books. So they're just like, let's bring all these characters now that we got the funding, and they go ahead and just make one big thing. And they've done it wonderfully. I think they've done a really lovely job. So
did you have anyone in mind for the voices then, Genevieve? I've listened to the audiobook too, and I love the voice work on that. But did you have anyone in mind?
No, not
really. You might not if it's an animation, no.
Right.
Just like the audiobook, like
right.
she was.
Right. Yep.
What about you, Gabriela?
I was kind of obsessed with Anne with an E, Netflix series based on Anne of Green Gables, and I just actually, as I was watching it, I felt like this Geraldine James, who plays Marilla in it, would be just wonderful as Alma. She just has that kind of air of distinction and like emotional depth to her that would be wonderful. And maybe like Lucas J. Zuman, I'm not sure how you read it, who played Gilbert, would be really good as Dran. Or maybe Ezra Miller, like something like, you know, a kind of dark, slightly foxy look to it. And Juliana Moore-Gillis as Alma. Sorry, not as Alma, as Myriad. That would be.
I just find it so much fun casting these things in my head, because I do that.
Yes, of course, we all do. It's, you know, if the world is listening, you know, if someone in the world is listening, if someone from Netflix is watching this, you know, these are our preferences. Maybe it'll spark the imagination of someone else. That'll be nice.
Definitely. Well, I cast them almost before I start writing, because I have to visualize everything. So I've already got it sort of sorted in my head. So if anyone makes it, they don't cast who I want them to. Get them. But anyway, well, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Genevieve, for joining us. Everyone should read both of these books, which I've got here. Or listen to the audiobooks, because I did, and they are also brilliant. But yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been awesome.
Yeah.